I have beneath my feet thousands of tons of gravel. This was a prime hay meadow. It's just horrendous.
It gets to the point of being soul destroying, really. What almost is the point in breeding the best cows? We've still got to carry on in the hope that one day we'll be clear of TB.
On behalf of the farmers, that we have been seriously intimidated and harassed, which is why we obtained an injunction from the High Court.
This is good for families, but it reminds us of the challenge our farmers face from volatile markets. The National Farmers Union have long argued they should be allowed to average their incomes for tax purposes over 3, and in this budget we will make that change.
There's all the risk at the moment in these extremely volatile times is with fair contracts in place that everyone in that risk.
These neonicotinoids to keep my insects at bay and establish my plants in a good order. We'll be questioning whether it's worth growing oilseed rape next autumn.
Good afternoon to this debate. The referendum that will be held in June on our membership of the European Union has been widely canvassed as being the most important political decision that any of us will take in our life. And I think it's at least arguable that no sector will be more affected than agriculture, given the close relationship between farming and the European Union at this moment. If this audience is representative of what we pick up from our own surveys, then some of you will already have made up your mind one way or the other, but there's still quite a large number of people who are undecided. And that's not surprising given the amount of uncertainty that surrounds these issues. Of course, Brexit, and there are a whole series of questions that we will be more clear about as to what kind of national agricultural policy we would have on access we would, and importing from the rest of the world, and what would happen to regulations. But not all the uncertainty relies on that side. There's also uncertainty if we stay in. We, of course, know what the benefit and what part of the CAP is from the renegotiation, that we have better regulation. Will that be achieved? And other similar of regulation problem for us inside the European Union. A last remark I'd make is that obviously this debate will focus on agriculture, but clearly agriculture is not the only issue in the debate, in the decision that people will make as to whether or not we stay in the European Union or not. The format of this debate is that speakers from both sides will have 15 to 20 minutes to put their case, and that will be followed up. We'll have questions. We've decided the order of batting by a toss of the coin. Daniel Hannan is going to start. Daniel Hannan has been MEP for South East England since 1999, and he's also a journalist. He does actually have some agricultural connections, if Wikipedia is correct. Apparently, he was born on his parents' farm near Lima in Peru, and also another farm, a cotton farm that they owned in Bolivia. So, Daniel, it's over to make your case.
Well, Martin, thank you, and thank you for inviting me as an MEP. It's quite nice for us to get out. We're not generally the most popular people in Britain, we members of the European Parliament. And no, don't all feel you've got to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. I've become accustomed over the years to our low profile and lack of popularity. Quite how low our profile is was borne in on me very forcefully just after I was elected, when a truly extraordinary thing happened and a constituent telephoned me. This is almost outside your experience, trust me, as an MEP. He phoned me at home, which was the number. Wonderful to hear from you. What can I do to help? He said, good. I'm glad I've got you. It's my drains. They're in a frightful state. They're all backed up, and I want to know what you're going to do about it. Well, of course, I didn't want to let the guy down. It's so rare that anyone ever phones an MEP. So I said, I'll tell you what, sir, you stay on the line. I'm going to give you the number of your local council, and the person you need to speak to there is the environmental health officer. Oh, he said, environmental health officer. Oh, I don't think I want to take it that high. So it's without any sense of false modesty that I stand before you this morning. Let me start this debate by sketching the global picture. In 1980, the 28 countries that now make up the European Union accounted for 30% of world GDP. Today, that figure is 17% and falling. Well, I say today it's 17%. It was 17% when I looked at it. This is impacting the EU's economy. Now, agriculture, like any other business, needs to be where the customers are. And it is increasingly clear with every month that passes that there are fewer and fewer customers in the European Union. Britain's exports to the EU have fallen from 55% in 2006 to 44.6% last year. I write a blog, and I made a jocular throwaway comment in it the other day. I said every continent on the planet is growing except Antarctica and Europe. And a Spanish friend of mine got in touch very crossly, and he sent me this long list of figures, and as I read down his stats, I had to accept Antarctica's doing fine. The cruise ships are returning, and the Antarctican economy is rebounding in line with everyone else's except Europe. Incredibly, the Eurozone is the same size now, economically, as it was able to compete when it's given a level playing field. I have every confidence in an innovative, effective, competitive farming sector to look at the bigger global picture. I want to give you two figures that I want you to bear in mind throughout this debate. £4.6 billion, £2.9 billion. These figures have full data available from. That was the £4.6 billion into the Common Agricultural Policy and got £2.9 billion back from the Common Agricultural Policy. When I say we, I mean the billion, 2.9 billion. Now, 2014 was not some kind of rogue year. Every year since we joined, there has been an imbalance. Britain is very unusual in the European Union in being a net food importer with relatively large and efficient farms. We've always, therefore, been both positively and negatively penalised. We're more into it than any other member state. We get less out of it than any other member state. That, indeed, is why Margaret Thatcher's rebate was negotiated in the 1980s. It's only a partial rebate. It only kicks in as a percentage of the difference between our contribution and our receipts. But by far the biggest cause of that discrepancy is the common agricultural policy. 4.6 billion, 2.9 billion. The reason I want to... This debate is often framed as though it were an argument about whether to subsidise British farmers. But nobody is seriously arguing that we would stop subsidising British farmers. The argument is about whether we should continue to subsidise your continental competitors. Under the CAP, we are giving a great deal more money to wealthy French or African farmers. And the real question for us is whether we can't manage better with a British agricultural policy tailored to suit the needs of our own countryside. Well, every country except New Zealand support. It's striking that the countries in Europe but outside the EU have a much higher level of per capita receipts in terms of farm subsidies than have the EU states. That's Norway and Switzerland. But no one is seriously disputing the principle of supporting the custodians of our landscape. And the reason, in principle, is that we have, in the English countryside, in the Welsh countryside, and the rest of these islands, we have a common resource, a commonwealth, whose owners are its custodians and stewards. We have a collective interest as a nation in preserving that resource, in passing on to our children the same inheritance that we've been lucky enough to inherit. And as a result, those of you who have land are, if you like, if I can put this very crudely, you are prevented by planning law from realising the full potential value of your land, because the rest of us, all of us collectively as a nation, agree that we don't want it all turned into golf courses or housing or whatever. There's no dispute about the principle of supporting farming. And there is a practical argument, answers that don't. Every other country in the world, Japan, the United States, Norway, and so on, they are all supporting their agricultural sectors. We could hardly expect British farmers to compete if the only ones operating under a £100 million. Well, is that the farming and food industry in the UK is bigger than the combined car and aerospace industry. So no potential future government is going to act without taking cognizance of that reality. The only question is how we do it at present. I gave you the key figure, 4.6 billion in, 2.9 billion back. Here's another one. Under the same year, 2014, British farmers received on average €229 per hectare, per hectare. We are, without question, I don't think anyone would seriously dispute, we are doing less well than our rivals across the Channel under the existing system. And I am certain that we could do better running in our own interests. Post the CLA some years ago had a very inventive idea about transferable agricultural bonds, looking at these Canadian ways of subsidizing particular things. Let me give you, again, in the broad context of those figures of what we're paying and what we're getting back, let me give you the simple way of doing it. We could have a straight acreage-based grant without any complexity, without any conditions, without any of the form filling that comes in as a result of the detail. I would say, just straightforwardly, we would guarantee that after we leave the CAP, for the next 5 or 6 years, we would guarantee all farmers an income of £90 an acre. Why £90 an acre? Well, that would bring you closer to the EU average. And of course, acre, because we'd be free to work in acres again, which I think would be in itself a rather nice ahead as anyone can look. And we would then, you particularly, the NFU and the CLA and other organizations, would look at how that needs to be tweaked, whether there are particular sectors within farming that need more support than that. But I'd have thought that's a fine figure that will make everyone on paper better off, while still giving us more than £1.5 billion in savings elsewhere. So everybody wins. Taxpayers win, consumers win, and our farming sector is guaranteed. And I am very confident competitors in the world. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job, right? As Martin mentioned that my father was a farmer, but I'm not. I live on a working arable farm in Hampshire, but I don't work it myself. So it would be absurd for me or for any other politician to start telling you how to do your jobs. But I have been a constituency MEP for 16 years. And I have heard again and again from my rural constituents, some of whom are members of this union and some of whom are, if you like, ordinary civilian farmers who are not, horror stories about what happens under the existing system. I've always struggled to understand, made the decision to support farming, why we feel we have to circulate all the subsidies through the clanking tubes and chambers of the Brussels machine, where it dribbles out at every stage before a little bit of it comes back, and we are expected to be grateful, even though that's so hedged about with condition. That's often almost more trouble than it would have been worth. I've been speaking to people now, at present, constituents who are small farmers operating within tight profit margins, and for whom this delay in payments doesn't mean that they don't get profitability and non-profitability. Something which bureaucrats and British officials seem unable to understand. The beauty of a straight acreage-based grant is it cuts all that out. All the measuring of hedgerows, all the form filling, it's a straightforward, easy calculation. The cost of administration is minimal. It's exactly the opposite of the CAP, which is about the most complicated and expensive and bureaucratic system of farm support ever devised, and it's a crowded field out there globally, but I think the European George Eustace already, and this is something that every constituency MP will recognise, a farmer whose wife had tragically died of cancer. She had always done the form filling and the applications. Because of that tragedy, he was late putting in his grant application. When the British minister said, well, this is absurd, of course we should pay, he said, you can't do that, it's not allowed under CAP rules. I know people will say, we have mad officials in this country, they gold plate things. But my friends, you need something to gold plate. That misshapen, burdensome lump of metal has to have come from across the channel before our officials get to start gilding it. And in a system that is as complex and as expensive as the CAP, stories like that are inevitable. They're not an accidental byproduct of the system, they are an intrinsic part of it. I have a constituency case which has been going on for years about somebody who was making a very specialist product involving cream. He was selling the byproduct as milk, he'd got permission to do it, and then he was suddenly stung with a consolidated fine for all the years that he'd been doing it, even though the inspector had told him it was okay. These things happen in a system which is based on quotas and support of various kinds and gradations of different grants. We could do much better if instead of working under a system that was designed to suit the smallholders of France and Bavaria, we had a British farming system designed for us. When I hear those stories from constituents, I've heard one or two of them even during this conference about things that have gone wrong, problems with payments, problems with bureaucracy. I have to ask, don't we think that we could do better? Are we like a disappointed wife who keeps on insisting against all the evidence that her husband's behavior is about to change? And how much worse do things have to get before we have the courage and the self-confidence to say, maybe we can design a system that gets better than this? Martin, in introducing this debate, made a very important point. There are risks and uncertainties both ways. Staying in the EU also brings risks and uncertainties. We can infer from the past what some of those are going to be, but there are also what Donald Rumsfeld would call the unknown unknowns. We've seen that the CAP support has gone from 70% to 40% of the budget. We've seen that our share has been especially deleteriously impacted as countries come in which attract a greater share of it, notably Poland. One calculation I saw is that if Turkey joined under the current terms, it would take up as much under the CAP as all the other countries put together, the way the rules currently work. There are known unknowns. There are uncertainties involved in staying. And one of them is the Luddism, the distrust of innovation and technology that is woven into the place where I work in Brussels. And to think of, just to pluck a random example from the air, more or less, the neonics ban over bees, accompanied by my colleagues in Brussels insisting that pollen in honey had to be treated as an additive. They really struggled. I mean, as I say, I'm not a farmer, but even I know that the pollen is meant to be there. It's not actually added. Can't manage better suited to our own conditions. A great number of rules on farming are now not decided at EU, but rather at global level. We talk about having influence at the top tables, but the top tables these days are not European. Whether we're looking at the world, those talks take place, is that New Zealand, Switzerland, they're all represented in their own name. The United Kingdom is represented by 1/28 of a European commissioner. Can't we manage? We are the 5th largest economy in the world. Catching up, supposed to overtake them by 2030. It's something to make us smile. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security. Our language is the most. We have the world's capital city. We have the greatest universities in Europe. We are at the center of the Commonwealth and the rest of the. We're able to run. And how much better do our world on a level field, but able to take advantage of the innovation and technology which the EU is so resistant towards, but which has always given us, down the ages, a competition. There are 2 potential futures here. No one can see the future with complete foreknowledge, but we know that the EU path leads to more stagnation. We know that we can lift our eyes to more distant horizons and rediscover our global vocation. 2 diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I should have mentioned at the start, actually, that the opposite point of view is now going to be George Lyon. George is a former president of the NFU of Scotland. He was then a member of the Scottish Parliament. He himself was also an MEP from 2009 to 2014 and was a prominent member of the Agriculture. And George is speaking on behalf of Stronger in Europe campaign. George.
Thank you. Good morning, conference. I'm really surprised this morning to see so many of you looking rather bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. My experience of NFU conferences, especially in election year, is that there's lots of free alcohol around, being bought by some of the protagonists. So you're actually looking in exceptionally good form this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have to confess today that I don't remember the last referendum in 1975. I'm obviously a bit too young. So waiting a generation for a referendum to come along, I suddenly find that 3 turn up at the Scottish one. Now we're going to have the EU one. And as sure as night day fall to leave. In 2014, we Scots faced a similar choice to the one put before you today. Should we stay with the UK or take a gigantic leap into the unknown with independence? I take it you all know him. All Scots would say if he was chocolate, he would eat himself, but I don't necessarily agree with that one. Anyway, Mr. Salmond, he claimed London was the cause of all of. They were unaccountable, too remote, and you took all our oil money and wouldn't give us enough back. Scotland had to stand up, reclaim our sovereignty if we were to prosper and succeed. And most importantly of all, he promised us that we could still keep all of the good bits of the UK, even after we left. You were such kind and generous neighbours. You were willing to share the pound with us, underwrite our debts, subsidise our wind farms, fees to our universities. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we Scots are a canny bunch. We're not taken for fools easily. We ignored the fanciful claims, the emotional tug on our heartstrings, and the promises we could both have our cake and eat it. We used our heads and pragmatically voted to stay in a not imperfect UK from perfect. And why? Because Scotland would be stronger, more secure, more prosperous, sharing power with the UK family. And today we're faced with an exactly similar choice on the EU. Should we stay in the EU, as I say, or take that gigantic leap into the unknown? Like the UK, the EU is far from perfect, and I would certainly never defend every bit of it. But of course, the Leave campaign blamed Brussels for every ill the UK faces. They take our money, they're remote, they put all these rules and regulations on us, and they don't understand us. And anyway, why should people there have any influence in our country's life? Brussels, they claim, is an overbearing bureaucratic monster that is holding the UK. That's the charge. Well, that is simply, completely, utterly untrue. The UK, as Dan has said, is the 5th largest economy in the world, being the biggest economy in the world, because the EU economy is bigger than the United States, bigger than China, and as long as we are right at the heart of it, we have the leadership of that huge economy. And of course, we have the fastest growing economic growth of any major country in the world. Indeed, the UK is growing faster than America, faster than Germany, and twice as fast as France. So we're already a strong and successful country, being part of the largest and most affluent economy in the world, because that has helped deliver that success. Why? Well, quite simply, it gives UK PLC unfettered access and a level playing field to the single biggest market in the world. And 44% of our UK exports go to the EU. And indeed, for agriculture, it's even more important. 60% of who set up their European factories here in the United Kingdom. Why? Well, one, because we've got very flexible labour laws. Two, because we are the platform into the EU market. And we're now a major car exporters in the world, when years ago we were a failed car-making country that had no industry left whatsoever. They invested here because they have access to the EU. And of course, full access to the EU market is critical if London is to remain a world financial centre. So being in the EU has not held our economy back. The opposite is true. It's helped make us one of the most successful economies in the world today. And of course, it's not just economic benefits that Europe brings. The EU was formed following 2 catastrophic world wars and has brought peace and security to Europe. Nations who fought each other now work with each other as members of the EU. I sit across the table, as Dan does, with our Polish colleagues, who not so long ago had nuclear missiles facing. And as soon as they got their freedom, they joined up with the EU for the access to the economy, for the strength and security that it gave them. So Europe has brought peace to Europe. And of course, together, the EU nations are a powerful force in the world. Together, we're able to stand up to the Americans, the Chinese, and of course, a very belligerent Russia on a host of global issues, which is vitally important in these. Members of the EU club, the UK has far greater clout in the world than it could ever achieve isolated and alone. So, ladies and gentlemen, far from holding us back, the EU provides us with a platform, a leading role in the biggest economy in the world, and real power and influence in that world. That's where we want to remain, I believe, is what is at risk. Now, the Leave campaigners claim that Britain can have an alternative relationship with Europe. We can abandon the EU, end free movement of people, stop paying into the EU budget, which, by the way, is not 18 billion, as George Eustace misled us this morning in his contribution, because he counted the rebate as part of our contribution. So at least if the Leave campaigners could get their facts right, it would be useful in this debate. So they are suggesting that we can, as I say, abandon the EU, whilst at the same time keeping all the bits of the EU we like, such as unfettered access to the single market. Well, I'm sorry, that is a deception. Britain can either continue to benefit from being part of the world's largest trading bloc, influencing EU and global rules so they work in our favour, or we stand on the outside looking in when decisions are made that affect our economy and our future. We cannot have it both ways. Now, the Leave campaigners, who seem to spend most of the time fighting with each other about who's going to be the lead campaign organisation, they cannot even agree what out would look like. Mr FRAgS, he wants us to be a larger version of Norway, joining fee, still accepting EU free movement of labour, still implementing the majority of EU rules, but of course having no say over what's in the rules or any influence over them. Of course, Douglas Carswell, who's in UKIP as well, he wants us to be like Turkey, which I'm not sure why, but there we go. Some want us to be like Switzerland, with only partial access to the single market, but our financial sector excluded, and of course still having to follow all the same rules as well, with no influence over what they are. Or some like Dan, who was very modest this morning, I have to say, Dan, in your presentation, who wants a free market, free trade utopia. And of course, the number one promise of the Leave campaign is cheap food, so you can imagine what the free trade policy is going to be like and where all this cheap food's going to come from. But at least he's honest, I think. So now, if Dan and his colleagues can't tell us what out looks like, why on earth should you vote for it? You have no idea what an out will look like if we vote to leave. And of course, we all know that the EU needs reformed. But the reality is it's the UK that's championed and won the battle for a reformed Europe. The single market and expansion to the east to create this huge 500 million market of wealthy consumers was all down to the United Kingdom. And it was the UK who succeeded in cutting the EU budget, cutting the number of bureaucrats by 5%, freezing their pay, slashing their generous payments, which saved us over €8 billion in the last round of the budget negotiations. And of course, the PM has secured a new deal that exempts the UK from ever closer union, guarantees we'll never have to join the euro, reduces welfare payment for immigrants and protects our finances, slashed red tape and secured special status for the UK. Why on earth would we take the risk of leaving? Now, ladies and gentlemen, as for me, myself, I'm a seventh-generation farmer, and my brother and cousins are all farmers. We're at the forefront of this debate. Absolutely, it's going to affect every aspect of our business. And for us, as farmers, the CAP is far from perfect, but at least it gives us a level playing field in farm support, safety net at times of crisis, access to markets, and the same rules on SPS and marketing. It ensures UK farmers are not disadvantaged against the vast number of heavily supported and protected agricultural sectors around the world. And of course, I'm sure the same is true for you, but EU support is absolutely vital for the financial prosperity of my family's businesses. And I'm sure when you do your books this year, the same will be true for you for this year, next year, and the following year again, as we go through these very difficult times. So our industry, we need to ask ourselves some pretty important questions in this debate, because your financial future is on the line if you don't get straight answers. If we leave, do we really think that our governments will continue to invest 3.2 billion euros in agriculture? And that's only the basic payment, never mind rural development, of course, and the regional payments that come into rural areas. Do you really think that future UK governments will plough that amount of money into UK agriculture? Will they support our industry over health, education in these austere times? Now, Dan made some huge promises this morning. £90 an acre, I think it was, Dan, was that right? Yet 2 weeks ago in a blog with Andrew Duff, one of my former colleagues, he said that he would take every penny of our contributions to Europe and give it to council taxpayers in the form of a discount on their tax bills. Or indeed, a few weeks ago, he said that UK farmers could compete with anyone in the world without any support whatsoever. I'm sorry, it's on your website and on your blogs, Dan. I'm just repeating what you say. So, the question is, how on earth can you, in your hearts, know for sure that you're going to get continued support? When it comes to government, how much money are you going to receive? And we'll have to look back to see what happened in the last spending review and the one before. Health and education was protected. Who got the big cut? I think the Treasury is quite powerful in this game. Will the governments take on the NGOs and public opinion and dismantle the current animal welfare, environmental and food safety rules? Do you really think they'll do that, as the Leave campaign promised? Just think of hen cages, sow stalls, live exports, or badger culling. Just think how tough they're going to be in that one. And of course, the UK will need to negotiate a new trade deal with the EU to get our dairy, beef, and sheep meat exports back into the EU. Now, there's two players in this negotiating game. On the other side of that negotiating table will be the French and our other southern European countries, who, of course, will be in the majority after we leave. And they're quite protective of their agriculture. So do you honestly believe they will give us as good a deal and access to their markets as we currently have? And those of you who produce lambs, just think on that and what that means for the French market, where 38% of our lambs are exported to. And of course, the other question, will UK governments prioritise agricultural interests over others when we renegotiate not only a new free trade deal with Europe, but with other 50 countries that the EU currently has trade deals with? Do you think that when push comes to shove, and let's always remember, agriculture is always the biggest sticking point in trade deals, do you think that your industry will be a priority for UK governments or the service sector in the city? I think the answer is the latter, not the former. So, if you think the answer is no to all of these questions, then I believe that if we leave, our industry will be left competing with the rest of the world with both hands tied behind our backs and facing a very bleak future indeed. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the Leave campaign would have you believe that the UK can only be successful if we leave the EU. Well, that's a false choice. It was a false choice in the Scottish debate, and it's a false choice in the EU debate. We're already a powerful, prosperous, and successful country. Our trade with the EU has contributed to that success and given us the leadership of the world's biggest economy. Leaving will put all of that at risk, cost us billions as we get through a messy divorce, and there will be no turning back, despite what Boris Johnson says. There will be no second referendum if we say no. We'll be out the door in 2 years' time. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the UK, and more importantly, UK farming, is more powerful, more prosperous, more secure inside a reformed Europe than standing alone and isolated on the outside. Of June, I want you to vote with your heads and vote yes to in. Thank you very much indeed.
much, George. I'll now ask Daniel to come back to the stage and give to the lectern with just 3 minutes of response to that.
Well, thank you. No one is suggesting that Britain would stand alone or isolated. We would be interested and involved in the affairs of every continent, including Europe. We'd still be full members of NATO, the Council of Europe, and we would still maintain our membership of the European market. And how can I be so sure? Well, look at Europe now. I always think it's better to work on the basis of empirical evidence rather than supposition. Right? In the whole of Europe, the European Parliament signed its association agreements with Moldova and Ukraine in 2014. Since then, we have a pan-continental free trade area wherein there are no tariffs and no trade barriers. The only geographically European states that are not part of that European market are Belarus and Russia, which have chosen to stand aside and set up an alternative Eurasian Union. So everybody else, you could travel from non-EU Iceland to non-EU Turkey, you don't bump into a single trade barrier. Is anyone seriously suggesting that if Britain withdrew from the political structures in Brussels, we would be excluded from that market? Ask yourself, what's the trade balance here? Every month we buy from the EU to the tune of at least £4 billion more than we sell there. It is not in the interest of any salesman to bully or threaten his customers. Right? So we just heard there, would the French try and keep us out? Yes. I mean, can you imagine a French president saying to his farmers as they protest and do their tractor go-slows and all the rest of it, can you imagine him saying, we have decided that you're not going to be able to sell your produce to the UK. You're not going to be able to sell wine or cheese or livestock because we somehow want to punish them for having done this deal where they can just stay in the free market but outside the political structures. I mean, I just don't think that is credible. That is absolute fantasy. It's sheer scare stories. But if, in some bizarre world, George is right, and I'm wrong about this, if we really are dealing with people who are that vindictive that they would cut off their nose to spite their face, that they would act against their economic interest in order to prevent us walking away and having an amicable settlement, what the hell are we doing inviting them to run the country? Can't we flourish as an independent people, trading with Europe, but living under our own laws? That's the way, truly, to get the best of all worlds. And for your industry in particular, think of the way the world is moving. Think of the growth and innovation and the growing markets on more distant continents. The single biggest block to global trade deals, from Europe's point of view and therefore from the UK's at the moment, is the common agricultural policy. Think of the opportunities that will be opened up to British farmers if we were able to sign our own free trade deals with non-EU countries. I've never said that you would compete without the same level of support that everyone else has in the world. That would be. But I do think you could compete without the level of over-regulation and bureaucracy intrinsic in this system. And I think if we unleashed the genius of this sector, if we just moved the rocks and let the grass grow, we could take on all comers.
Thank you, Daniel. And George, your 3 minutes.
Well, I come back to the points I left you with. And Dan actually highlighted one of the key reasons why your industry would be so exposed if you left. What's always one of the major stumbling blocks in negotiating trade deals? Agriculture. Why? Because we've got a whole lot of sectors that we think are important and do need some form of protection. That's why agriculture is always the last chapter to be negotiated. And it's not just about tariffs. I was in the US with the Washington negotiators last week. And they're incandescent that we want the SPS rules lifted, that we want the GIs recognized, that we want to see movement on exports of beef. Because Dan lives in this pure, idealistic world where he's never actually had to negotiate anything in his life, certainly not in the European Parliament, because he's never actually ever taken a file on. And the reality is that when you're negotiating with people, then they have their red lines, you have their red lines, and there has to be then some way to find and square that circle. So of course, Europe values agriculture, and therefore it's always a difficult one, and there's some really serious red lines that are in every trade deal. But clearly, if the Leave's number one priority and the number one benefit of us leaving the EU is cheaper food, I think that tells you everything about what the negotiation is going to be like. They're going to roll over, sacrifice your industry to get cars, financial services into any other country. Because let's face it, are we going to take on the Mercosur countries and export to them if we're outside the EU and make some money at it? You're obviously not a very good businessman, Dan. Are we going to take on Australia, what some of the other Commonwealth countries, and export our products to there? Don't think so. I don't think so, especially in beef and sheep meat. So, I say to you, your business future is on the line. You think long and hard about some of the answers to these really difficult questions about how much support you're going to get in future from a future government. And of course, I could read you out the 2010 manifesto of Dan's own party, which says we will phase out direct subsidies by 2020. That was the negotiating position in the CAP negotiations by the Tory government. So he might speak for himself, but he doesn't certainly speak for governments, and we all know what Labour think of subsidies. Margaret Beckett says, open the doors and bring in every free and cheap bit of food you can find. So you think long and hard, ladies and gentlemen. It's your future that's going to be decided in 4 months. You're at the very forefront of this debate, and I say to you, you're much safer, more protected, stronger, and better able to compete inside the EU than you ever will be outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers. We now have about half an hour for questions. So we have a couple of roving microphones. So if you want, so anyone wants to make a question, please questions rather than political statements. Is it everyone's? Go on. So, right. I will repeat what I said. I'll repeat what I said. I just want a question, not a statement. Stuart?
2 questions for George, Chairman. I'll play by the rules, don't you worry. George, you just talked about Mercosur. You and I were on that Agriculture Committee in Brussels. The fear of that committee was that the EU were going to sell the beef sector down the river to Mercosur, because Mercosur countries, the EU wanted to export high-tech goods to Mercosur countries. You complained, Jim Nicholson complained, I complained, and we complained because we couldn't do anything about it. So could you revise what you said about Mercosur? The other question I want to ask you is about labelling. We are not allowed to label farm produce in this country the way we would like to label it, because the EU stop us from doing it. Doesn't that worry you?
Well, Stuart, in response to your first question, yes, we're concerned about Mercosur, but given that your campaign has promised cheap food and big cuts in food prices, one can only imagine that you're going to source it from Mercosur and all over the rest of the world. So I suggest you can contemplate whether you're in the right campaign or not. I think on the issue of labelling, yes, we would all like to label our own country of origin, but as an exporting country, the thought would horrify me as a sheep farmer that the French would be able to label every lamb French and ours as foreign imports. So it works both ways, Stuart. You've got to be a wee bit careful on that one. If you're an exporter, you get benefits from non-discrimination in other EU markets because there's the ability to promote your own individual country's product is prevented because of the single market rules. And that's why they're there, to give us a free, level playing field. So I do think if you do want to fight off Mercosur, Stuart, you should think about changing sides, I think, in that one.
Thank you very much. There's a questioner over there, that microphone to the right.
David Brooks. I'm a Eurosceptic, but I have to say what I've heard today from Daniel Hannan. I actually had a bank manager called Hannan, and he shafted my business. the evidence so far in every European negotiation on CAP reform has been that the UK governments have gone in to reduce CAP payments. There's no evidence to back up that we'd have any support to be able to compete in any level playing field going forward. I'd like to see more.
Thank you, David. Sorry, I can't see because of the lights, but I'm just sorry I didn't recognise you. But over to you, Daniel.
I'm afraid I can't do anything about whichever distant cousin it was who was working in the bank. But there is a difference about there's a difference between what you're complaining about, which is the Treasury asking for a better deal in the CAP, and the principle of farm support. And it comes back to that figure that I kept on quoting, the discrepancy between what we're paying in and what we're getting out of the EU. Right? There's a discrepancy of the better part of 2 billion. It doesn't make sense for any UK government to increase the CAP as a share of the European Union budget when the vast majority of that increase is not going to you, but is going to your rivals across the Channel. We could make a huge saving while still not just protecting, but improving the position of UK farmers. George has conflated the issue of tariffs with the issue of farm support. I don't want to be dishonest here. I think that in a post-EU world, we would be looking towards a free trade global future. And that would mean that there would be less of an external tariff. And that's why it's necessary to allow British farms to compete without the handicap of being the only unsubsidized sector in a world where every other country from North America to East Asia does subsidize farmers. But I come back to the point I opened with. We are attached to a declining, innovated Eurozone. All the growth is going to be overseas, and that applies equally to your sector as to anyone else's. I was doing a debate with a Labour pro-EU guy the other day, and he said, you know, we sell more to Belgium than we do to the whole of India. I said, yeah, that's precisely the problem. Right? Which of those two is the better long-term prospect? And that's as true of our farming sector as it is of any other part of our economy.
Thank you.
I can only say that you're right not to trust Mr. Hannan, I think, on your experience of your previous bank manager, because there's forked tongues going on here. On the one hand, Dan has been very, very clear how much he dislikes subsidies. He's a free marketeer, a right-wing member of the Conservative Party. And it really makes me laugh to hear him saying, of course we will subsidise your industry. We're committed to subsidising you. Well, I'm sorry. In every other platform I've heard him speak on, it's exact opposite. So I think you have to weigh all of the evidence up. And as I say, the opening negotiating position of UK government was to phase out farm subsidies in the last negotiation. The manifesto of 2010 of the Tory party was to phase out farm support. By 2013, actually, it used to be. They've now moved it a little to 2020, so there you go. A wee bit of breathing space to adjust, maybe. But at the end of the day, your future, if that support is not forthcoming, if the trade deals do not protect your interests, then I cannot see how many of our sectors can survive and compete. And as I said, what markets are we going to then export into? We export into the US, where if you look at the actual value of their commodities, we'll struggle to compete with them, especially in beef. And by the way, there's $29 billion of subsidy going into the US industry this year. That's the amount of farm support they get. So these two issues are absolutely critical to your future. Trade deals, access to the EU markets, how important it is in negotiating future trade deals, and the ongoing farm support. And as I say, I certainly wouldn't hold your breath on a UK government cutting red tape all over the place. I don't have to tell you about badgers and the devastation that that's done, and that's a UK piece of legislation. Sow stalls and tethers, hen cages, all legislated for in the UK 12 years before the rest of the EU was forced to comply. So we had a handicap, and what happened to our pig industry is now half the size it was previously. So if you want an idea of what regulation, poor regulation, or being handicapped is about, our pig industry shrunk because of that one decision to go for a higher welfare standard in the UK So I think your future, by and large, is far more secure, stronger within a reformed EU.
Thank you. I've got a questioner at 1, then there's somebody at the other. The next question will be that person over there. Then I've got Michael Sly and Peter Gadd, I think. So over to you.
Daniel, trust in me. Your maths are wrong. You said 2.5 billion, it's 1.7.
Then that makes my case even more strongly. What I said was that that was the amount of money we were getting back as a whole. I didn't say it was all going to farmers, because it counts the administration cost, which of course is very high under the CAP. You know, I just repeat the point. How bad do things have to get? I mean, all the time that I've been a constituency member, George must have had the same thing. People complaining about the effect of the beef ban, the bans on GMOs, the over-regulation, the RPA, all of these things. If you then turn around in the next breath and say, but we can't imagine a better future, we have to stick with all of this, well, okay, fine. You've made that decision then, but please stop complaining about it. Or can't we imagine doing better in control of our own affairs? Are we that diminished as a people?
Okay, question there, yes.
Question to both of you. Colin Rayner, a farmer from Windsor. You both argued well today. I'd like to ask George, in 2000, when we decided to not join the Euro, we were told that if we didn't join the Euro, this country was going into decline. It hasn't happened. I'd like to know what your view was was then. And we now got the most successful economy in Europe, apart from Germany. Also, could you name me one advantage for us leaving the Euro? And also ask Daniel, could you give us one advantage for staying in? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to answer the first part of the question, because it was clearly directed at me. I never supported joining the Euro for one simple reason. I already live in a single currency area. I know how single currency areas work. They're called the United Kingdom, where 4 nations share a currency. We also share political institutions that allow us to redistribute between them when times are hard and one part, the wealthier parts redistribute. And that's fundamentally what needs to be able to happen to make a single currency work. So I didn't believe it. I actually believed the Eurosceptics, Dan and all the rest of them, who said, actually, this won't work. And they were right. And now we see the Eurozone countries having to move closer together to make that work. The big advantage now, of course, is we are absolutely guaranteed we're locked out, although the premise we're ever going to get in was pretty thin anyway. And we're also locked out of ever closer union, 2 things which I heartily agree with. We were right to stay out of the Euro. We benefited from it. As I said, and as Dan has said, we're now the 5th largest economy. We lead the biggest economy in the world because we're one of the major powers in the EU. EU has not held the UK economy back whatsoever. As George Osborne has said, we are the fastest growing economy in the world for the last 2 years, beating America, beating Germany, twice as fast as France. So we can have the best of both worlds, and that's the way I want it to continue.
No one seriously questions that Norway and Switzerland are part of a European market. And no one seriously contends that they are in the CAP. They are able to flourish, yes, supporting their farmers financially and trading both with their neighbours and further afield. And they don't have the Habitats Directive and all the other nonsense to worry about. But Colin, who is a constituent of mine, asked a very sharp question, which is, can I see any advantage in staying in? Well, speaking personally, yes. I have a very comfortable and well-remunerated job as a member of the European Parliament. And I am asking you to sack me from that job, or at least to make the job redundant. And the reason that I'm asking you to make that job redundant is because I think that the UK as a whole will do better, and I, as a British citizen, will have plenty of other options in a growing economy. And that's why I'm a little bit sort of downhearted when I hear George putting the whole argument in terms of, oh, we couldn't survive, your industry is on the line if you're not commodity. You know, I don't believe that we are incapable. I think the reason that the CAP clobbers us is because our farms have always been more efficient and more productive than their rivals. I think we could do much better if we had a British farming policy designed to suit your needs.
And just on a point of fact. Of course, Norway has access to the EU markets, but of course, it's called the FRAgS member of the EU. We make all the decisions and the rules, and we fax them to them, and they have to implement them. And there's Norwegian.
What percentage of rules?
75%.
No,
it is 75.
No, it's
well,
not.
sorry, that's what the Norwegian minister said on the television
That's
the other night.
That's right. That's
and
what
he
the
said
head of the Norwegian European movement said.
Every week.
That's what the head of the European movement
And they
in
also
Norway
have
said, which
to-
is the equivalent of asking Peter Mandelson, right? Now, let me tell you what the actual figure is. Let me tell you the actual.
Accusing the Norwegian European minister of lying, are you?
Yes,
Mr.
I am, and I'll
Hannan?
tell you why.
I think
Because
that's a bit extreme.
I'll tell you why, and I'll make a bet with you about this if you like, George. I went to the EEA Secretariat, and I got a list of every EU legal act since 1992, when Norway joined the European Economic Area, and they tabulate how many of those have applied to Norway, and the actual figure is 9.05% since 1992. And what George has done is he's taken a throwaway remark from a quite extreme pro-EU campaigner in Norway who said, oh, about 3/4 of our laws, and he's translated that into an official-sounding 75%. The actual figure from the data is 9.05%. In the case of Switzerland, there's absolutely no dispute. It's 0%. Switzerland doesn't have to import a single EU legal act. It sometimes chooses, for reasons of economy of scale, to adopt similar things, as we would no doubt do. Of course, we would have to meet EU regulations when selling to the EU, just as we have to meet Japanese regulations when selling to Japan, but we wouldn't have to impose all of those costly standards on our domestic commerce and industry or on the non-EU share of our exports.
Well, actually, that is wrong, because, of course, if you go to Brazil and you look around the factories there that export into the EU, of course, they have to meet the EU standards on food hygiene, all the regulations from the slaughterhouse is exactly the same. And you're right, in terms of being right and factual about laws, I mean, the Leave campaign claimed that 75% of our laws is a direct result of us being members of the EU. The House of Commons showed quite clearly that 6% of primary legislation is because of EU laws, and another 7% in secondary. So that claim is completely spurious and wrong.
I'm going to use my chairman's prerogative to tell you the list of examples of EU legislation that applies in Norway. Plants, which is the Sustainable Plant Protection Products Directive, the placing on the market of plant protection products, the Nitrates Directive, the Water Framework Directive, the Sheep Electronic Identification Directive, Welfare of Laying Hens Directive, and the Protection of Pigs, Tether and Sow Stall Ban. The one that doesn't is the Habitats Directive, because I believe that Norway has more stringent regulations on habitats. So that's the answer.
I rest my case.
That's the answer on that one. Michael Sly.
Can you... thank you, Martin. Yes, Michael Sly, East Anglia. Can I move this on a little bit to a wider level than just agriculture? Because in the grand scheme of things, on June the 23rd, we'll all make our mind, may affect us more than any other sector of society. But talking of the rest of society and civilization, the United Kingdom, in its formation, had a very painful and difficult birth. Could the panel tell me and this auditorium that the vote on the 23rd of June is also a vote that we signal the breakup of the United Kingdom, and that England will be leaving the United Kingdom, and the potential that Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will remain members of the European Union, or even more drastically, that Northern Ireland then may have to seek union with the Republic, and the consequences that may ensue. And I think that for all the debate and all the sixth form debating that's going on, the really do we wish this country that so much blood, sweat, toil has been expended on over many centuries. And before I finish, just remind everyone that in 1808, with Wellington and an allied army, we went to save Europe and ourselves from a despot. The same again in 1914 and 1939. Have we learnt nothing from history? Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess There's not really much to say to that one. Well, given I'm a Scot, maybe I should. You know, we do constitutional politics as a full-time occupation, I'm afraid, in Scotland. But the point you make is a very, very, very serious one. I was part of the Better Together campaign, led the rural part of that during the referendum in Scotland. And we won that referendum by a 10% vote, mostly because people took a pragmatic view. They used their heads, not the nationalistic rhetoric that we got from Mr. Salmond and all the rest of them, and all the promises of how everything would be wonderful and you could keep all the good bits while leaving. And we decided that sharing power was actually in our best interest. What I'm concerned about is that if we do leave, and there is a vote, then that's fine. But it will shoot as night follows day. If there's a majority in Scotland who voted the other way, it will trigger another referendum. I'm not convinced we might win that second referendum. And I suppose the same might be true of Wales. What would happen between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, given they share a land border and all the difficulties we've had there in trying to make peace, goodness only knows. But I think it would be a terrible legacy for the Prime Minister if, because of an internal party fight, where in every poll I've seen, the question of Europe always, in terms of the most important thing concerning people's ranks 12, 13, 14. Now, we've been forced to have this vote because of that huge split in the Conservative Party over Europe. And I just hope that the Prime Minister's legacy is not that he ripped us out of Europe and split the UK in half, because I think that's a hugely damning legacy, and one that damages the UK forever.
There are lots of reasons why people in Scotland may vote for or against the Union. And as with the EU question, there are good, sincere people on both sides of it. But I really struggle to imagine anybody saying, I voted for the UK in September 2014, but I've now changed my mind because I'm so desperate to join the euro. Such a person may exist, but I've yet to come across him or her. In fact, the Chief Minister of Scotland, we will have a referendum in the opinion polls, which of course was always true. It was just refreshing that she was so flagrant as to come out and say it like that. So she isn't thinking in terms of the EU thing. She's waiting until the polls move, and if anything, the polls have moved in the other direction since the last referendum. As for Northern Ireland, I really do think this is, in a way, scare stories, and we're used to some rather lurid, and there would be a return to a closed border. When has there ever been a closed border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland? There have been times when the relationship between London and Dublin are much worse than they are today. The Republic of Ireland did not leave the UK as a result of a peaceful referendum of the kind that we're having. It left as a result of an insurrection, and yet, not only was there no closure of the border, but people carried with them mutual voting entitlements, mutual social security claims, everything carried on. Why? Because it didn't make sense for either side to unpick relations that were working well. And the same will be true when we leave the European Union. It won't be in the interest of either side to unpick structures and institutions that work well. The idea that we're suddenly going to start deporting Polish barmaids or, airlifting pensioners from the Costas is ridiculous. Nobody is proposing a radical break of that kind. What we're talking about is putting this country on a different trajectory, one where we turn away from the declining and arthritic Eurozone, the only bit of the world, to repeat, that is not growing, and turn our face to the prospering continent further afield. And one last point. My father, like many of yours, did fight for our right to live under our own laws in the last war. I think we shouldn't trivialize what it means to be an independent people living under our own parliament. I'm not claiming any kind of monopoly of patriotism. As I say, there are good, sincere people on both sides of this debate, but think long and hard before we toss aside in peacetime, without a shot being fired in anger, freedoms that our fathers were prepared to defend with force of arms.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman over there who's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you very much. My name's Andrew Wood. I'm from Derbyshire. My question, nobody's touched on it yet, but We've got the supermarkets. Who's going to protect us from them? Because ultimately, if we're out of Europe, they'll be able to source their food from within the European Union, and I'm quite sure with the euro and various other things, they may be able to do it at a favourable rate. Will they look after British farmers, or will they just look after their own profit margin? Because if the supermarkets wanted to look after us, it's all right saying about the country of origin labelling. There could be clear differentiation now on packaging if supermarkets wanted to put it there, but they don't because it's not in their interest to do it. And that's the problem we've got. Who's going to look after us? Because the supermarkets won't.
I mean, it's obviously not the job of the supermarkets to. That's not how it works. They are interested in making money, and it's the job of regulators then to step in and do that. You don't expect people to do it out of charity. I cannot tell you, and neither can anyone else in this room, precisely what's going to be the relationship between agriculture and retailers 5 or 10 years from now, inside or outside the EU. We should be realistic about this. You know, when George says, spell out in precise detail exactly how a post-EU Britain would look, I'm not going to be the Prime Minister. Right? You would all laugh at me if I was so presumptuous as to start laying down in exact, meticulous detail how it would look. He can't tell you how it will look 5 or 10 years if we stay in. Right? The future is misty. That's just reality. But I can say that taking control is the safer choice. It would then be our decision, whether it's on the relationship between supermarkets and farmers or anything else. It would be up to us, through our own democratic mechanisms and procedures, to come out with a regime that suits us.
Well, I'm glad to hear Dan admit that the £90 an acre he promised you is actually non-deliverable, because he'll never be Prime Minister, never be in a position to actually deliver on the promise he made you all here today. So I think you take that promise with a pinch of salt. Coming back to your original point, what we do know about the Leave campaign's one of the main claims that they make to benefit leaving is that we're going to cut the cost of food in the shops. So I can only surmise that is we're going to open up trade with all the Mercosur countries, with the US and Australia, to import all of this cheap food. And that means a huge threat to your industry.
And an opportunity.
Only if your cost of production is lower than theirs, Dan. And unfortunately,
no,
that is not the case. Oh, equality, right. So, yeah. How many of us experienced this where 99% of shoppers pay more because it's British? Have we experienced this one? Anyone know the answer to that one? No, afraid not, Dan. I think that's a rather...
That's very, very defeatist.
It's a rather hopeful promise.
It's very defeatist, George. You're saying that no one is able to compete.
No, what I'm saying is that the notion that you are going to get British people willing to pay a higher price for British food. We've been pushing that line for a long time. And to be fair, some do. Some will pay a bit extra for a gas, will pay a bit. But by and large, the majority of the population look at the price and buy the cheapest. And unfortunately, that's where we are.
I have a higher opinion of the people in this room than you do.
Well, you maybe can afford to.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Pettit? Yep. Oh. Okay. Sorry. Balcony, then.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Excuse me. George Hosford from Dorset. I've enjoyed the debate enormously, as I'm sure many of us have, but I'm struggling with the head versus heart thing. I've got to try and keep it simple in my own little brain. On June the 23rd, I've got to put across there or across there, and the only way I can look at it is by process it in my own mind is to read you this question I wrote earlier. According to today's Times, leaving the EU is likely to reduce UK farmers' incomes by a half, and this will probably not be made up by the Treasury, no matter what Dan says. It also says that the NFU is likely to swing behind the Remain campaign in April, which was news to me, although this might be a flight of fantasy by the journalist. Should you ever trust journalists any more than politicians, I wonder. Could our speakers please explain why otherwise sane farmers might choose the roller coaster of 5 yearly government change in exchange for the cosy security of the bureaucratic monster that we love to hate?
Sorry, Daniel, you're a politician and a journalist, I think.
I can only repeat that you won't find any party leader saying we will phase out all support for farmers. I mean, that just, so this, George is either knowingly or unwittingly conjuring a fantasy.
No, I'm quoting your party manifesto, Dan.
No,
sorry.
No, there is a difference.
It's quite a robust document.
No, there is a difference between saying we don't want to give any more money to the CAP because most of it is not coming to us.
Subsidies, it says.
Yeah, but that was within the context of staying in the CAP,
Oh, right.
right? Outside the CAP, of course. And I've been quite straight about saying I am in favour of having a free trade approach to the world. Yes, that does mean that there will be cheaper imports, as there were before we joined, and that's the big payoff to consumers. I'm not going to disguise that from you. But the flip side of that is, of course, there then has to be a measure of direct support, and I've spelt out how we can make it more generous than it is now and much simpler to claim without all the bureaucracy, without all the monstrosity that the questioner refers to, and while still making a big saving because we're no longer sending all the money overseas. Right? I think that is effectively how, now you can tweak it then as the years to take my word to the figures that I've been quoting throughout, 4.6 billion in, 2.9 billion out. That's not a promise of mine, those are hard data. And one last point. People will often say this renegotiation was a waste of time, it hasn't changed anything. It wasn't a waste of time. It proved one thing beyond doubt, which is that the EU is not going to reform in a way that is congenial to British interests. No change, no treaty. None of the promises that David Cameron made has been fulfilled. If this is how we are treated now, when we, the second largest contributor, are about to vote on leaving, can you imagine how we would be treated the day after voting to stay? Can you imagine what it would be like if I go back as a British MEP after a vote to remain in and start saying I want a better deal, whether for the British farming sector or for any other aspect of national... Can you imagine? They'll say, oh, look, you just voted for the existing terms. You just accepted the supremacy of EU law. You basically just accepted the deal that you've had. Forget it. And so we need to be very clear about the choice. We can see which way the EU is going. The euro crisis, the migration crisis, we are getting dragged into those things. We're making them our problem if we stay. Or we can have a different relationship based on free trade, friendship, and intergovernmental cooperation. There is no status quo in this referendum. There's a choice between two alternative futures. I have confidence in the British people being able to follow their own dream and their own task.
Well, the answer to your question, of course, is following your heart, I think, could leave you with quite a big financial headache. And I was tempted in the Scottish referendum by the patriotic nationalistic jingoism that came out of the Nationalist Party, because it is very, very appealing and very seductive. Because when you promise people that every problem they have will disappear if only you break up the United Kingdom or leave Europe, then people can take that in any way they want. And it is a seductive message. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you really think you can have your cake and eat it? Do you really think we can leave and still have access to the markets in the same terms and conditions? Do we really believe that we're going to still receive the same support and that when it comes to trade deals, we're going to still be a priority when it comes to negotiating? All these new trade deals will have to be negotiated. So my advice to you is follow your head. But I would say in terms of CAP and all the greening and the cross-compliance that we all distrust, Brussels doesn't actually force you to do this. It is not compulsory to fill in an IX form, but your accountant, by and large, I think, would insist it's probably important for your business. So you have a choice right now. You can opt out of the whole thing if you choose to do so. You can opt out the greening because there's no financial penalty. You just lose the payment. So Brussels is not forcing you to do all of these things. Your accountants, by and large, are. So I ask you, think with your head when it comes to June the 23rd. Because once you vote to leave, there is no way back. There are no regrets. There are no second negotiations. It's over. And the question then becomes, how long are we out of these markets? How long is it going to take to renegotiate our way back in? By and large, Mr. Hogan the other night at our reception set, when he was asked the question, he said, well, guys, he says, we're big traders with the UK, I reckon 10 to 15 years to do the Irish bit of this one. So that's the reality. And that's the reality the Scots were faced with as well. And that's why we used our heads. We took a pragmatic view and we said, we're stronger, safer, and better off within the UK. And I believe we're safer, stronger, and better off within the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, my apologies to Sarah Pettit and Peter Gadd. We've run out of time. That was, I'm afraid, had to be the last question. I'd like to thank both of the speakers, both of the people participating in this debate, putting their cases very eloquently, with a lot of passion. I know I started by saying there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainties. I'm not sure how much of the uncertainty is gone now. But thank you very much, and I hope you've all enjoyed the debate, and I'd like you to thank the two speaker presenters.
Thank you, Dan, for that.
Yeah.
Please, before you leave, please, just a few words of summing up. I promise you I will not keep you long from your lunch. First of all, can I thank Martin, Daniel, and George for a fascinating debate over the last sort of hour and a half. I guess it's whetted your appetite for the debate over the next 4 months. A few words of summing up. First of all, can I thank everyone for coming along to this year's conference. Standing here and seeing this auditorium full to the very top then says to me that the farming industry and the NFU as an organisation is in good heart. It's been a fascinating 2 days, and I'm delighted to see the engagement between our members with policy makers, with decision makers, and particularly our professional staff at the National Farmers Union. And you good people didn't see it, but when you go down to the press room and you see the number of journalists in the press room, and then you sort of read the coverage that we have had as an industry, food and farming, over the last 48 hours, then there is no doubt this conference has put food and farming very much on the national agenda. And can I thank all those journalists who have been with us at the conference, say a big thank you for coming along and again supporting this great industry over the last 2 days. We've covered many issues. Some of you have said to me that my opening remarks were overtly negative. But can I say to all of you, it has been important to highlight the difficult times that we face at the present. I, like many of you, have encountered challenging times before, and I am confident that the determination and resilience of our farmers across our industry will show through. My frustration is similar to all of yours. As a mixed farmer, I understand the pressures that are on all sectors of farming at the present time. But as I said yesterday, it does not have to be like this. If the basic payment scheme fiasco in England and Wales, it could have been avoided if government had acted on our advice earlier. If the introduction of countryside stewardship had been piloted, then the problems that we have encountered could have been avoided. With longer-term planning and commitment from everyone in the supply chain, that we, all of us in that supply chain, can earn a fair living, and everyone carries the risk and the reward of supplying great British food to our loyal customers. We heard yesterday from David Hughes the importance of provenance of food and a backstory to go with the food that we produce. We were all pleased to hear the Secretary of State's determination to roll out the TB strategy, and that should give hope to thousands of farming families. We've had some fascinating breakout sessions yesterday afternoon on the commodity issues and this morning on various topics. I attended the Working Together breakout session, and again, that highlighted to me the importance of greater collaboration and cooperation across the supply chain. And can I wish Rory Christie, in setting up his dairy producer organisation, all the very best, because I honestly do believe that through producer organisations, those of us dairy farmers who are not part of members of co-ops then can help to spread that risk and reward right across that supply chain. The timing of this conference, so soon after the decision to hold the European Union referendum, has created a huge interest in this extremely important subject, as we heard from the debate earlier today. And there is no doubt that this vigorous debate will go on over the next number of months. And we at the National Farmers Union will produce further evidence in the weeks ahead so that we can all debate and hopefully answer the questions so that we can all make that informed decision when it comes to the referendum day in June. Above all, when I look around this auditorium, I've been so delighted to see so many young people attend this year. And I do hope that your enthusiasm is not undiminished, because you are the future of this great industry. And I believe that Mr. Chris Manley would like to say a few words at this stage. Can I congratulate you, Chris, on being elected as the National Chairman of the National Federation of the Young Farmers Club. So, Chris, if you want to say a few words, please take the microphone.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow young farmers, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of all the young farmers here at the conference to thank the NFU for the opportunity for us to attend the conference. It's a unique experience for us to engage with fellow farmers, key industry people, and most of all, a chance for us to potentially work with difference. I think the working session earlier on how we can work better together is key, and I think it's a real sign that both at county and at regional level, this is very much happening. I'd also like to highlight the great work that Richard Bauer and the NFU Next Generation team are doing, and we really welcome the involvement in working with our YFC Agri steering group. When it comes down to it, it's important that we really work together in backing the future of British farming.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for those very kind words. And again, I'll echo your views. It's so important that our Young Generation Board works closely with the Young Farmers Club because, as I said, you are the future of this great industry. It's important that we thank the people who have helped to organise this conference. And that's Mr. Chris Taylor, Jeanette Clark, and their team. This has been a huge effort. And when I first became involved as an office holder of the NFU, we used to sort of contract out the organisation of this fabulous conference. Today, we do it in-house. And I can assure you, when you see how these people have operated, not just in the last 2 days, but setting it up, everything's gone like clockwork. So a very, very big thank you to you all, and we are greatly indebted. Thinking back to last night, I thought we had a highly successful dinner. The food was superb. And I'm delighted to say that the raffle will earn RABI in excess of £8,000. So again, can I thank you all for your generosity, and I know the RABI will put that money to very good use. So in conclusion, thank you all very much for attending. There is now a break for lunch. Please attend the annual general meeting at 2:30, and then the great excitement of a special council meeting thereafter. So can I wish you all a safe journey home and wish everyone a profitable and a productive year ahead for farming, and I can assure all of you that the NFU will always be there to support you. And let us all go back to our counties, to our farms, and let's back the future of British farming. Thank you all for attending.